Chapter 2. Around 4800 BCE humans domesticated horses. They began riding them around 3700 BCE. This was the first time humans experienced long-distance travel across the Central Asian steppes. Some would define domestication as human control over breeding. There is evidence that horses were kept as a source of protein before being trained as working animals. All modern horse populations retain the ability to revert to a feral state, and feral horses can be domesticated because they descend from ancestors that escaped from captivity. Fossils from 4000 BCE show evidence that includes changes in butchering practices, changes in human economies and settlement patterns, the depiction of horses as symbols of power in artifacts, and the appearance of horse bones in human graves. Measurable changes in size and increases in variability associated with domestication occurred between 2500–2000 BCE, as seen in horse remains found at the site of Csepel-Heras in Hungary, the former domain of the Bell-Beaker culture. Use of horses spread across Eurasia for transportation, agricultural work, and warfare. Around 4200 to 4000 BCE, more than 500 years before the geographic expansion evidenced by the presence of horse bones, new kinds of graves appeared north of the Danube Delta in the coastal steppes of Ukraine near Izmail. These graves are referred to as Suvarovo graves and are similar to and probably derived from earlier funeral traditions in the steppes around the Dnieper River. Some Suvarovo graves contained polished stone mace heads shaped like horse heads and horse-tooth beads. Earlier steppe graves also contained polished stone mace heads, some of them carved in the shape of animal heads. Settlements in the steppes contemporary with Suvarovo, such as Sredny Stog II and Derivka on the Dnieper River, contained 12–52% horse bones. When Suvarovo graves appeared in the Danube Delta grasslands, horse head maces also appeared in some of the indigenous farming towns of the Tripolia and Gumelitsa cultures in present-day Romania and Moldova, near the Suvarovo graves. These agricultural cultures had not previously used polished stone maces, and horse bones were rare or absent in their settlement sites. Probably their horse head maces came from the Suvarovo immigrants. The Suvarovo people in turn acquired many copper ornaments from the Tripolia and Gumelitsa towns. After this episode of contact and trade, but still during the period 4200–4000 BCE, about 600 agricultural towns in the Balkans and the lower Danube Valley, some of which had been occupied for 2000 years, were abandoned. Copper mining ceased in the Balkan copper mines, and the cultural traditions associated with the agricultural towns were terminated in the Balkans and the lower Danube Valley. This collapse of Old Europe has been attributed to the immigration of mounted Indo-European warriors. The collapse could have been caused by intensified warfare, for which there is some evidence, and warfare could have been worsened by mounted raiding, and the horse head maces have been interpreted as indicating the introduction of domesticated horses and riding just before the collapse. However, mounted raiding is just one possible explanation for this complex event. Environmental deterioration, ecological degradation from millennia of farming, and the exhaustion of easily mined oxide copper ores also are cited as causal factors. Equity died out in the Western Hemisphere at the end of the last glacial period. Domestication may have saved the species on the Eurasian continent. While the environmental conditions for equine survival in Europe were somewhat more favorable in Eurasia than in the Americas, the same stressors that led to extinction for the mammoth had an effect upon horse populations. Thus, sometime after 8000 BCE, the approximate date of extinction in the Americas, humans in Eurasia may have begun to keep horses as a livestock food source, and by keeping them in captivity, may have helped to preserve the species. Horses also fit the 6 core criteria for livestock domestication, and some people say that they chose to live in close proximity to humans. One model of horse domestication starts with individual foals being kept as pets while the adult horses were slaughtered for meat. Foals are relatively small and easy to handle. Horses behave as herd animals and need companionship to thrive. Both historic and modern data shows that foals can and will bond to humans and other domestic animals to meet their social needs. Thus domestication may have started with young horses being repeatedly made into pets over time, preceding the great discovery that these pets could be ridden or otherwise put to work. However, there is disagreement over the definition of the term domestication. One interpretation of domestication is that it must include physiological changes associated with being selectively bred in captivity, and not merely tamed. It has been noted that traditional peoples worldwide, both hunter-gatherers and horticulturists, routinely tame individuals from wild species, typically by hand-rearing infants whose parents have been killed, and these animals are not necessarily domesticated. On the other hand, some researchers look to examples from historical times to hypothesize how domestication occurred. For example, while Native American cultures captured and rode horses from the 16th century onwards, most tribes did not exert significant control over their breeding, thus their horses developed a genotype and phenotype adapted to the uses and climatological conditions in which they were kept, making them more of a landrace than a planned breed as defined by modern standards, but nonetheless domesticated. Central Asia is bounded on the north by the forests of Siberia. The northern half of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, is the middle part of the Eurasian steppe. Westward the Kazakh steppe merges into the Russian-Ukrainian steppe and eastward into the steppes and deserts of Tsungaria and Mongolia. Southward the land becomes increasingly dry and the nomadic population increasingly thin. The south supports areas of dense population and cities wherever irrigation is possible. The main irrigated areas are along the eastern mountains along the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers and along the north flank of the Kopet Dak near the Persian border. East of the Kopet Dak is the important oasis of Merv and then a few places in Afghanistan like Herat and Balkh. Two projections of the Tian Shan create three bays along the eastern mountains. The largest, in the north, is eastern Kazakhstan, traditionally called Jetiso or Semirekai, which contains Lake Bakhash. In the center is the small but densely populated Fergana Valley. In the south is Bactria, later called Tokaristan, which is bounded on the south by the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. The Sir Darya, Jaxartes, rises in the Fergana Valley and the Amu Darya, Oxus, rises in Bactria. Both flow northwest into the Aral Sea. Where the Oxus meets the Aral Sea it forms a large delta called Khwarezm and later the Khanate of Khiva. North of the Oxus is the less famous but equally important Zarafshan River which waters the great trading cities of Bokhara and Samarkand. The other great commercial city was Tashkent northwest of the mouth of the Fergana Valley. The land immediately north of the Oxus was called Transoxiana and also Sogdia, especially when referring to the Sogdian merchants who dominated the Silk Road trade. To the east, Tsungaria and the Darim Basin were united into the Chinese province of Xinjiang about 1759. Caravans from China usually went along the north or south side of the Darim Basin and joined at Kashgar before crossing the mountains northwest to Fergana or southwest to Bactria. A minor branch of the Silk Road went north of the Tian Shan through Tsungaria and Jetiso before turning southwest near Tashkent. Nomadic migrations usually moved from Mongolia through Tsungaria before turning southwest to conquer the settled lands or continuing west toward Europe. The Kyzyl Desert or semi-desert is between the Oxus and Jaxartes, and the Karakum Desert is between the Oxus and Kopet Dak in Turkmenistan. Khwarezm meant approximately northeast Persia and northern Afghanistan. Margiana was the region around Merv. The Usturt Plateau is between the Aral and Caspian Seas. To the southwest, across the Kopet Dak, lies Persia. From here Persian and Islamic civilization penetrated Central Asia and dominated its high culture until the Russian conquest. In the southeast is the route to India. In early times Buddhism spread north and throughout much of history warrior kings and tribes would move southeast to establish their rule in northern India. Most nomadic conquerors entered from the northeast. After 1800 Western civilization in its Russian and Soviet form penetrated from the northwest. Since gaining independence in the early 1990s, the Central Asian republics have gradually been moving from a state-controlled economy to a market economy. Reform has been deliberately gradual and selective, as governments strive to limit the social cost and ameliorate living standards. All 5 countries are implementing structural reforms to improve competitiveness. Kazakhstan is the only CIS country to be included in the 2020 and 2019 IWB World Competitiveness Rankings. In particular, they have been modernizing the industrial sector and fostering the development of service industries through business-friendly fiscal policies and other measures, to reduce the share of agriculture in GDP. Between 2005 and 2013, the share of agriculture dropped in all but Tajikistan, where it increased while industry decreased. The fastest growth in industry was observed in Turkmenistan, whereas the services sector progressed most in the other four countries. The republics which have fared best benefited from the commodities boom during the first decade of the 2000s. Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have abundant oil and natural gas reserves, and Uzbekistan's own reserves make it more or less self-sufficient. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan all have gold reserves, and Kazakhstan has the world's largest uranium reserves. Fluctuating global demand for cotton, aluminium, and other metals, except gold, in recent years has hit Tajikistan hardest. Since aluminium and raw cotton are its chief exports, the Tajik Aluminium Company is the country's primary industrial asset. In January 2014, the Minister of Agriculture announced the government's intention to reduce the acreage of land cultivated by cotton to make way for other crops. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are major cotton exporters themselves, ranking 5th and 9th respectively worldwide for volume in 2014. Although both exports and imports have grown significantly over the past decade, Central Asian republics' countries remain vulnerable to economic shocks, owing to their reliance on exports of raw materials, a restricted circle of trading partners, and a negligible manufacturing capacity. Kyrgyzstan has the added disadvantage of being considered resource poor, although it does have ample water. Most of its electricity is generated by hydropower. The Kyrgyz economy was shaken by a series of shocks between 2010 and 2012. In April 2010, President Kurmanbek Bakiyev was deposed by a popular uprising, with former Minister of Foreign Affairs Rosa Otunbayeva assuring the interim presidency until the election of Almazbek Atambayev in November 2011. Food prices rose 2 years in a row and, in 2012, production at the major Komtor gold mine fell by 60% after the site was perturbed by geological movements. According to the World Bank, 33.7% of the population was living in absolute poverty in 2010 and 36.8% a year later. Despite high rates of economic growth in recent years, GDP per capita in Central Asia was higher than the average for developing countries only in Kazakhstan in 2013, PPP $23,206, and Turkmenistan, PPP $14,201. It dropped to PPP $5,167 for Uzbekistan, home to 45% of the region's population, and was even lower for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Kazakhstan leads the Central Asian region in terms of foreign direct investments. The Kazakh economy accounts for more than 70% of all the investment attracted in Central Asia. In terms of the economic influence of big powers, China is viewed as one of the key economic players in Central Asia, especially after Beijing launched its Grand Development Strategy known as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, in 2013. The Central Asian countries attracted $378.2 billion of foreign direct investment, FDI, between 2007 and 2019. Kazakhstan accounted for 77.7% of the total FDI directed to the region. Kazakhstan is also the largest country in Central Asia, accounting for more than 60% of the region's gross domestic product, GDP. The Central Asian Republic's ambition of developing the business sector, education, and research is being hampered by chronic low investment in research and development. Over the decade to 2013, the region's investment in research and development hovered around 0.2–0.3% of GDP. Uzbekistan broke with this trend in 2013 by raising its own research intensity to 0.41% of GDP. Kazakhstan is the only country where the business enterprise and private non-profit sectors make any significant contribution to research and development, but research intensity overall is low in Kazakhstan, just 0.18% of GDP in 2013. Moreover, few industrial enterprises conduct research in Kazakhstan. Only 1 in 8, 12.5%, of the country's manufacturing firms were active in innovation in 2012, according to a survey by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. Enterprises prefer to purchase technological solutions that are already embodied in imported machinery and equipment. Just 4% of firms purchase the license and patents that come with this technology. Nevertheless, there appears to be a growing demand for the products of research, since enterprises spent 4.5 times more on scientific and technological services in 2008 than in 1997.